Okay, so we're going to be discussing Hilchas Pesach for the next couple of weeks. Okay. Last year, before Pesach, we spoke about the mitzvah of Magid, of Higadat of Avincha, of Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim.
Monday night share?
No, the Monday night is not going to be so much halacha. There'll be a little bit of halacha, but especially if people who are here now come to the Monday night, they'll have to make sure there's no overlapping or minimal overlapping. Last year we spoke the halachas of Magid. So this year I'm going to focus this week and next week on one of the other mitzvahs of the seder night, and that is the mitzvah of Haseba. The mitzvah to recline.
I wrote a whole topo as a blocker about whether women are commanded to recline.
Oh, so we're gonna. Very good. So we'll discuss that. I'm not yet sure if that's going to be this week or next week. So one of the mitzvahs of the Seder night the Chacham instituted is to recline. I've mentioned a number of times, and I'll mention again. The mitzvah of Haseba does not mean to lean to the left. Lean to the left is a myth. It's recline to the left. And the difference is that this is not to fulfill any mitzvah. You have to be leaning onto something. So ideally you should have a pillow. It says in Shulchan Aruch, that's what you're supposed to do. That's what the Rebbe did. You should have a pillow to make it comfortable or something. And either you have another chair or an armchair, or you turn your chair around, or something to make sure. If you just have a chair like this, you turn it around and you sit like this. So then you try and make yourself as comfortable as possible under the circumstances, and you're reclining. Now, there is a chakira in Achronim, and the Rebbe discusses this in the Kutei Sichos, about this mitzvah. So, when do we fulfill the mitzvah of Haseba? Basically, you fulfill it while you're drinking the 4 cups of wine, while you're eating the kazayas matzah. That's the most important times to do it are those 2 times, when you eat the 4 cups of wine and the kazayas matzah. It is also lachatchila, the Alter Rebbe Paskins, you also have to recline when you eat the sandwich, the koirich, and also when you eat the afikoyman. And the reason for this is basically because when we have the sandwich, even though we've already eaten the matzah, but the reason for the sandwich is because when Hillel had his seder, he did not eat matzah before. He had his matzah as part of the sandwich. That was the only time he had the matzah. Now, for various reasons, we can't do that. Technical, we're not going to get into that right now. For various reasons, we have to have matzah before the sandwich. But yet, at the same time, while we're having the sandwich and we're trying to commemorate the way Hillel did it, well, when Hillel did it, he was now eating his first kazayas of matzah. So therefore, we have to recline when we have the koirich as well. And additionally, we recline for the eating of the afikoyman at the end. I don't know if you're allowed to say afikoyman nowadays. I think you have to say afiko people.
That's good one.
When you have when you have the afikoyman at the end of the seder, you also recline because that is commemorating the Korban Pesach, and the Korban Pesach also used to be eaten b'haseba with reclining. Now, I'm gonna use the sort of the format that the Rebbe uses to discuss this. So it starts off with getting sort of deciphering different details of the text, which we don't have in front of us, so that's not going to be meaningful. But there's 2 ways to understand this mitzvah. One way to understand the mitzvah is that in order that there's a biblical mitzvah to eat matzah, for example. And in order to fulfill that obligation, you have to recline while you're eating the matzah. And if you didn't recline, then you have not fulfilled the mitzvah of eating matzah.
Really? Aren't they two separate mitzvahs?
1 second. That's one way of understanding it. Right? And therefore, indeed, by the way, the halacha is that if a person ate matzah without reclining, then he has to eat another kazayas of matzah while he's reclining. Right? Because it's not good. But the question is, why are you eating the matzah again? Are you eating matzah again because when you ate the matzah the first time round, you didn't recline and therefore you did not fulfill the obligation to eat matzah? Or no, you fulfilled the obligation to eat matzah, you just haven't fulfilled the obligation to recline. In order to fulfill the obligation to recline, you have to eat matzah while you're reclining, because that's the time that you have to do the mitzvah. The mitzvah has to be fulfilled while you're eating matzah. It has to be done both. Yeah, it has to be done while you do. I'm just using matzah as an example. Now, this does sound very theoretical, but it's important to understand that it will have relevances. It does have relevance in a number of practical things, which we're probably not going to. Well, we'll get to some of them right now, but next week we'll perhaps see some other examples of questions which we like what to do in certain circumstances. For example, somebody who finds it difficult to do certain mitzvahs of the seder for health reasons or whatever, and this becomes a very relevant topic. So I believe it's an important exercise when learning halacha, to sometimes something sounds completely theoretical and very nuanced and a bit tedious, and we get a tendency to sort of, okay, let's just fly over this and get to the practical part. But it's important to focus on it and understand it properly, because you never know what the practical ramifications of this will be down the road. Now, just for now, I'll give you two possible practical relevances. If somebody ate matzah, he made the bracha al achilas matzah, he ate the matzah, and he ate it sitting up straight, and then he remembers that he has a mitzvah to recline, so he has to eat the matzah again. When he eats the matzah again, does he now make another bracha al achilas matzah? My
guess is no.
Why not?
Because you're not saying the blessing over the reclining. You're saying it over the matzah, and you ate the matzah.
But that's precisely our question. If we say that seder has become an indispensable element of eating matzah, so you haven't fulfilled your obligation to eat matzah, just like if you ate less than, let's say you ate matzah and you ate less than a kazayis. You only had a tiny little piece like this, right? And then, let's say you're masiach das. That means you've sort of, if you're still in the situation, then you don't make a bracha again. But let's say it's an hour later, and somebody came to you and he said, hey, you have to have a piece of matzah this size? So then I think it's obvious that you would have to make a bracha again, because you ate matzah, but you didn't fulfill the obligation to eat matzah because you didn't eat enough.
But then you just said it's an hour later. He's talking about what if you.
Let's say it's an hour later.
Oh, okay, yeah, then probably you have to say.
So it's something he ate matzah. He ate the whole matzah. He did the very ultra religious size of matzah, but he wasn't reclining, and now he has to eat matzah again. So does he make a bracha al achilas matzah?
It's pretty big, because then you said God's name in vain and all.
Right.
Why do you have to say it again?
Well, if he didn't fulfill the mitzvah, then he'll have to say it again.
You weren't
You didn't
reclining.
feel the reclining.
Oh, so that
Matzah.
well,
Matzah you fulfilled.
that's very good. So now I'm happy that I brought on.
Two choices.
But I started off with two choices. Is a seder a necessary requirement in the mitzvah of matzah, or is it an independent mitzvah?
I say it's independent.
You say it's an independent requirement, and Steve also says it's an independent requirement.
Well, although there isn't a separate bracha for that mitzvah, you just have
Well,
to do
yeah,
it. Yeah?
there are mitzvahs that we don't say a bracha for. Right?
But okay, it's two separate mitzvahs, but they have to be done together. So they're like separate, but codependent.
But
Yeah, but that doesn't mean you have to say the bracha.
Right.
okay, I'll ask you another question. There is a halacha that somebody who is sitting in front of his Rebbe is not required to do Haseba. For example, when the Rebbe had the seder in 770,
out of respect.
Until his mother-in-law passed away in 1970 or 71, so the Rebbe would do the seder upstairs in 770, and there were guests at the table, and none of them reclined. Only the Rebbe reclined. Right?
Do you have
And
to ask? Okay.
so here's the question. Let's say, this could have been relevant then, because the Bachrim, what they would do was, they weren't invited to sit around the table. There was only so much room around the table, but what they would do was, they would run to the kitchen and have a very quick seder, and then come to the Rebbe's seder to finish off and watch the Rebbe's seder, right? Now let's say one of the Bachrim who was in such a rush, and he forgot to recline, or he thought that reclining means to lean to the left and not to recline to the left, and then he came there, and somebody said to him, you have to eat the matzah again because you didn't recline. Now, and
But now he's in a situation.
but now he's in a situation where he's not required to recline. So if you say, listen closely, if you say that reclining is a indispensable element of the mitzvah of eating matzah, so beforehand he ate matzah without reclining, he did not fulfill the mitzvah of eating matzah, so now he has to eat matzah again. Now it happens to be that this time when he eats matzah, it happens to be that this time when he eats matzah, he's not going to recline because now he's exempt from the requirement to recline. But at the time that he originally ate the matzah and he had that requirement and neglected to fulfill it, so then he didn't fulfill the mitzvah of matzah. 1 second. But if you say that haseba is a requirement in the mitzvah of matzah. If you say that haseba is its own independent mitzvah, but the time to do it is while you're eating matzah, so beforehand he ate matzah, he fulfilled the obligation to eat matzah, he didn't fulfill the obligation to recline. Now he can't fulfill the mitzvah obligation to recline anyway. So what's the point of eating matzah again?
Exactly, I was
Right.
going to say that. No reason to eat again.
Well, why don't you just go in a different room and eat it
That
and
would be
leave?
my thought. Go to the kitchen, reheat the matzah, come back.
Because his teacher now his Rebbe needs help. His Rebbe called him. He's not feeling well, and he needs somebody to stand at his side and help him.
So he helps him, then when he's done, then he goes back in the kitchen.
When he's done, it's past the time. It's past midnight.
Yeah.
He's screwed.
I think that's what it says.
Yeah, he's fine.
So these are two of the again. Now I want to predict that I'm pretty sure that next week or the week after we'll get into some more interesting nafkaminas. But the point of these nafkaminas in Tanya, everyone here is somewhat familiar with Tanya, I'm sure. In Tanya, right in the very beginning, in chapter 5, it talks about the quality of learning Torah and how studying Torah is the most intimate connection that a person can have with Hashem, because the concept of understanding, when a person understands a concept, that concept becomes one with him. And so when we understand Torah, we become one with Hashem, with Torah, and because Torah is Chachmasei Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in other words, it's not just like if I write an essay and you understand it, so my essay has become part of you, but I haven't become part of you, my essay has become part of you. But Torah, as it elaborates on in Tanya, is not like a human essay. Torah, the Chachma of Hashem, is part of Hashem. It's something which he says, he brings over there that it's not really, he quotes the Rambam, that it's not possible for humans to understand this but properly. But the concept, the idea that the Torah is Chachmasei Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and he gives that example of like you're giving the king a hug, and it's the most intimate connection. Yichud kamoy she'ein kamoy v'lo yikar k'nimtza klal b'gashmis. It's a type of unity and connection that we don't have any parallel to it in this world, right? And he says over there that it's absolutely nothing to do with whether or not it has any relevance l'maisa. So he says if you understand the halacha, that he gives an example of chesed mishpat, of monetary issues, that in a case where Reuven makes such a claim to the money and Shimon makes such a claim to the money, and then the halacha says that the law is such and such, says even if it has never and will never happen in history that these claims and these exact claims come to court, it's irrelevant, because the purpose of Torah study is not only to know what to do in such and such a situation. The Torah study in and of itself is important. So when I'm bringing to you these examples of what the practical relevance would be, it's not because I need to figure out what this person is going to do and you're telling him, oh, well, go to the kitchen. I don't care what he's going to do. It could be this is never going to happen. The point of the practical example is to extenuate what the difference between these two ways is. Right? I don't need the example to ever happen. I just need the example is just the way. Because when I started off and saying, well, is a seder part of matzah, or is a seder its own mitzvah? So it sounds a bit like semantics. It sounds like I'm just playing with words. So by giving a practical example, the example doesn't have to be practical in the sense that it might actually happen and I'm going to need to know what to do. It's just practical in the sense that it gives more meaning to the two sides of the coin. Okay, so
His Rebbe would know intrinsically that he hadn't reclined and would excuse him specifically to go do it.
okay. There is a Rosh who discusses what to do if somebody drank the third or fourth cup at the seder without Haseba. Do you have to drink them again? And he says like this: on the one hand, if you let's say drank the second cup without Haseba, so you drink it again, that's not a problem. But the third and fourth cup, which is after the meal and after benching, over there you're not allowed to just drink wine for the sake of drinking wine, and therefore because you're not allowed to have anything extra. So he says he's not sure what to do, because imagine somebody benched and had the third cup without, or the fourth. Let's talk about the fourth cup. He had the fourth cup, the fourth cup, which he said halal over at the end of the seder. He drank the fourth cup without reclining. Now he's not really supposed to have any more cups. So if we say, well, he didn't fulfill his obligation, so he has to drink a cup again, maybe. Or no, if he drinks a cup again, then it's going to look like he's adding a fifth cup. We don't like that.
So here again, it would depend. If you're not yoitza the wine because you didn't bend over, you didn't lean, then you're allowed to have another cups because you didn't have that third cup. You weren't yoitza. If you just weren't yoitza heseba, that then maybe there's taka.
Oh, very good. So because that's exactly what the Rosh says, and the Rebbe is deducing from this Rosh that how you could only say Lamaisa. By the way, I'm pretty sure we paskin that if that happened, you don't drink. If the third and fourth cup, you don't drink them again. But that's also connected with the fact, as we'll discuss later, that it could be that nowadays a seder is not as strict of a requirement as it used to be. But anyway, that's exactly the point. So because the Rosh says that perhaps by the fact that you drank that you drank it without Haseba, so sort of that determines that wasn't one of the four cups because you didn't drink it properly, right? Just like if you drank orange juice, it wouldn't be one of the four cups. If you drink wine without reclining, it's not one of the four cups, right? So that would seem to be proof that Haseba is not its independent mitzvah. Haseba is a requirement in the drinking of the wine and in the eating of the matzah.
Where's the origin?
By the way, well, I'm
Torah
going
doesn't say
I'm going to
drink
get
wine and do it b'heseba.
Well, the Torah doesn't say drink wine either, but that's coming up soon. And there's other. I'll just give you one of the other proofs to this side of the coin is that the Mishnah says, the Gemara says, what about a shamish? If you have somebody who's a waiter who's Jewish, so his job is to serve everyone on the table, but he also has to do his own requirements. So he says, Hashamish achal kazayas matzah. Hashamish who ate a kazayas of matzah, kshuhu meisev. If he was reclining yotza, he fulfilled his obligation. Meisev that, and the Gemara says in that, well, meisev, and if he reclined, he fulfilled his obligation. Lo meisev lo. If he wasn't reclining, he did not fulfill his obligation. And then the Gemara goes to analyze that more. But just from those words of the Gemara, it seems pretty obvious that the Gemara understands that reclining is an element in the matzah. Because if you understand that reclining is a requirement in the matzah, so then it makes sense to say, well, if he reclined, he fulfilled his obligation of eating matzah. If he didn't recline, then he didn't fulfill his obligation. But if reclining is its own independent obligation, so then how could you? Then obviously, if he didn't recline, he didn't fulfill his obligation. Like it's a redundancy to say that if it's its own, its own mitzvah. So based on these and other things, it seems apparent that the mitzvah is not its own independent mitzvah; it's a requirement in the mitzvah of matzah. However, there is a very strong source to suggest otherwise. And the main argument for the other side is that it says in halacha that the minimum requirement to seder, to reclining, is for the matzah and the 4 cups of wine. However, if somebody wants to eat the whole meal while reclining, then that is a mitzvah minamuvcha, that is an extra good mitzvah. And nowadays it's not our minhag to do so, as perhaps we'll discuss today or later, next time, whatever. But in halacha it says that it's an extra good mitzvah to recline during the whole meal.
Aren't you supposed to recline when you say that, God?
No.
Oh. Well.
On the contrary, you're not supposed to recline when you say that God. Well,
It's only when you miss the
Because
bracha.
the Alter Rebbe
I know,
says.
but the armchair's there, the pillow's there. What do you think I'm gonna do? Sit
Oh,
straight.
well. Okay. That's your choice.
The Alter Rebbe says.
I hear you.
No. It's just a pashut.
Now that they.
It doesn't mean you shouldn't say.
Really, it's later.
The Alter Rebbe says about.
Sooner, right?
Hold on.
Yeah.
You mentioned a very important thing. Here. Mem ches ein bei ein ginem ches. Okay, it doesn't say it about the Haggadah, but yeah, it does. It says even though, generally speaking, Hallel must be said standing up, nevertheless, on the night of Pesach at the seder, when we say Hallel, because everything is done derech cherus, in a way of expressing freedom and royalty, we do not require the person to stand up. However, you should not read the Hallel or the Haggadah reclining on your side. Rather, you should sit be'ema over yira. You should sit. How do you say be'ema over yira in English? With awe. I don't know. Aim of fear. With awe. You should sit with awe, right? Yeah. So the mitzvah to recline when you eat the matzah and recline, but during the reciting of the Haggadah, one is supposed to sit with awe. There's actually a shtickle ha'ara over here because we say in the story of the 5 rabbis. It says, they were reclining in Bnei Brak, and what were they doing? They were Mesaprim B'Yitzias Mitzrayim. They were reciting the Yitzias Mitzrayim.
But in those days, they didn't have real chairs. They had couches.
No, so the thing is like this. It's not the pshat is like this. So some say that they were tzaddikim, and for them, even when they were reclining, they were sitting with awe, and that's different. But I don't think one has to say that because it really gets into a bit of etymology over here. But there is ample precedence to the term mesubim in that context doesn't have to mean reclining, it just means convening. Mesubim Bnei Brak, in the Haggadah it may translate it as they were reclining in Bnei Brak, but perhaps the correct translation is that they convened in Bnei Brak.
What's the interpretation of convening?
That they just got together.
Mesibas Shabbos.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean leaning.
Exactly, there you go.
It means Suda, no? Or something.
There is another story, there is a Gemara in Brachos which says that Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah were, quote, mesubin in one place, and Rabbi Yossi was reclining and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was standing upright. So clearly, So it says they were mesubin, and then it says he was standing upright. So clearly mesubin doesn't have to mean reclining. So when it says the five rabbis, not necessarily were they reclining in Bnei Brak. So when you're reading your Haggadah in English and it says they reclined in Bnei Brak, you could say actually that's the wrong translation. Anyway, so back to the point at hand is that it's very difficult to understand why it would be a virtue, why would it be considered virtuous to recline during the rest of the meal on the Seder night, if reclining is an element of eating matzah. If reclining is its independent mitzvah, so you say the minimum requirement is to recline while you eat the matzah and drink the wine, but the more the merrier. Because what's the idea of reclining? The idea of reclining is because you're supposed to express freedom and royalty and right, that whole theme. So the minimum requirement is to do it during the eating of the matzah, but if you do it for the rest of the meal, that's even better. But if you say that reclining is a part of the mitzvah of matzah and drink, right, you have to eat matzah, you have to eat the kazayas of matzah, and you have to eat it in Kedei Achilas Pras in that certain time frame, and you have to eat it in a reclining position. So then, what's the point of making a Hanukkah party on Purim and reclining during the rest? Like it doesn't right? You don't like the menorah on Purim, you don't recline during Shulchan Aruch, and you don't do Kiddush Levana at the end of the month. It just doesn't work.
Say it's a separate thing.
Oh. So the maskana of the Rebbe's approach to this is that actually both are true. And again, this is only a condensed version of the discussion here in the Rebbe's discussion of the treatment of the subject. But the Rebbe's maskana is that both are true. That Haseba starts off as it's a mitzvah to express freedom by reclining. But besides that, it's also what the Chachamim made it into an indispensable part of the mitzvah of matzah and drinking the 4 cups, and now everything falls into place because it has to be both. Now, Reb Shalom asked before, where does it say you have to recline? So, the pashtus, reclining is not a biblical mitzvah. Reclining is a rabbinic mitzvah. And on the night of the Seder, there are a number of mitzvahs that we do. Some of them are biblical, like reciting the Haggadah and eating matzah. Most of them, eating maror in the times of the Beis HaMikdash was biblical, now it's rabbinic. Korban Pesach, it was a biblical mitzvah that we don't do today. And then there's a number of rabbinic mitzvahs, 4 cups of wine, reciting Hallel. So reclining is one of the of the rabbinic mitzvahs. However, if you read the Rambam, it sort of upgrades it from a regular mitzvah d'Rabbanan, because there is a known principle, a well-known principle in halacha, that with the Rambam every word is exact. One of the words that the Rambam uses, which we often build big castles on, is the word lefichach, which means therefore. When the Rambam says A and therefore B, the therefore is very precise. Now in this particular case, the Rambam says like this. In every generation, a person is obligated to show himself, to express himself as if he himself is just now leaving the oppression of Egypt. Concerning this, God commands in the Torah that thou shalt remember that you should remember that you are a slave, as if to say, as if you yourself were a slave and you right now were redeemed and went into freedom. So the Rambam says that there is a biblical mitzvah, it's a biblical mitzvah, to perceive oneself and perhaps even show oneself as having left Egypt yourself. Then he says, lefichach, therefore, when a person eats on this night, a person has to eat and drink in a reclining manner, in a way of freedom, etc., etc. Right? So the Rambam introduces this concept as the biblical precept of perceiving oneself as currently being redeemed from captivity into freedom. And therefore, what does the therefore mean? The way you express this freedom is by reclining.
When you eat
And I think what the pshat, what?
when you eat and drink, not just the 4 cups and the matzah. It says when you eat and drink the whole night, like I do.
But no, but then he goes on to, no, I didn't quote the whole Rambam. He goes on to, right? So it doesn't mean that you can't sit on your armchair for the rest of the Seder, but it means you should sit upright. So essentially what the Rambam is doing here is a very interesting thing, I believe, and there are other examples of it. I'm struggling to come up with good examples, but there are a number of examples of this, where you have a concept which it's a rabbinic institution. The Torah doesn't require you to do it, but if you do it, you're fulfilling a biblical precept. Right? So it upgrades it from a regular mitzvah d'Rabbanan.
So in most cases, though, it's recommended to do it, right? If it's biblical.
Yeah, oh no, of course you have to do it. You have to do it anyway.
Yeah.
But I'll give you an example. Maybe not the best example, but according to many authorities, there is no biblical mitzvah to daven every day. There's a biblical mitzvah to daven when you need something, right? It's not from a biblical level. It doesn't have to be every day. But the precept of davening is a biblical precept, and therefore, when you daven every day, you're fulfilling a biblical precept. Or giving tzedakah, right? So there's the minimum requirement for tzedakah, which is to give a tenth, or to when somebody asks you and you're able to give them, etc., etc. What if you give more tzedakah than the basic minimum that you have to give? Of course, when you give that extra tzedakah, you're fulfilling a biblical mitzvah of tzedakah.
To a limit.
Yeah, fine. But I'm saying is that even though the Torah doesn't necessarily, you fulfilled your obligation. Nobody's asking you for money right now, so that's one possible obligation. You've given a tenth. You've done all your minimum requirements have been fulfilled. The Torah doesn't demand for you to give any more tzedakah now. That doesn't mean that if you give tzedakah, you're not fulfilling the biblical mitzvah of giving tzedakah. Right? So the same thing goes over here. The Torah requires you to perceive oneself as, and laharis es atzmoit, we'll speak about that more another time maybe, not just to perceive oneself, but to actually express it outwardly, that is if you are right now being freed from slavery. Right? The Torah doesn't require that you do that by reclining. You can do it any way you want. But when you're reclining, you're fulfilling that biblical precept.
Well, it's the how-to. I mean, it's like my taxes are due, okay? I have to pay my taxes or else, right? But I don't know how to do it unless I buy the software and put it in my computer, or I go to an accountant so that I know how to express it and actually do it, right?
Yeah,
so what you're saying is there's a biblical requirement to actually feel that you're going out of Mitzrayim, but how do I do that? It's thousands of years later, and the Rambam is telling us how to do it. Right?
Yes, but the point.
He's tying it back in because it's still a mitzvah, a biblical mitzvah. That's
the point I'm saying is that on a biblical level, you could have chosen to express the fact that you're going freedom some other way. Just by drinking wine. Drinking wine is an expression of freedom, right? You could have said, the Torah demands that I express the freedom of the night. I'm going to fulfill that precept by drinking wine, which, by the way, is also true. That's one of the reasons why the Chachamim instituted 4 cups of wine, is because of the freedom, right? But that's right. So you could. So it's an example of something which is of rabbinic origin, but yet when you do it, it's upgraded to being fulfilling a biblical mitzvah of that. Now again, there isn't a huge practical difference whether it's rabbinic or biblical. You have to do it anyway. But there are some differences, and we may or may not get back to discussing them. By the way, on the flip side, we have also examples the other way around, where something that you do is biblically okay, but the Chachamim say it's not okay. So, for example, there is a halacha that we actually discussed this last year. We discussed this last year about Magid, that the Mishnah says that if a person doesn't say Pesach Matzah Maror on the Seder night, those three things, and explain them, he hasn't fulfilled the obligation of Magid. So we said that it's possible, according to some opinions understand it this way, that there is a biblical mitzvah to recount the Exodus of Egypt. And the Chachamim came along and said that in order to fulfill that obligation, you have to explain the meaning of these three concepts, Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. And if you fail to do so, then perhaps you have neglected your mitzvah on a biblical level. Sort of, the neglecting of the rabbinic precept can mean that you haven't fulfilled the mitzvah at all. Another example of this, we don't pass in this way, but this is an example in the Mishnah of where somebody's sitting in the sukkah, and here's the line of the sukkah. So my whole body is in the sukkah, but my table with my food is in my house. Right? So you're not allowed to do that. Everyone agrees you're not allowed to do that. But the story was that the Ziknei Meshame went to visit Rabbi Yochanan ben Achiranis, who was sitting like that in the sukkah, and they told him that if this is the way you sit in the sukkah, you've never fulfilled the mitzvah. And Tosfos there says that they held that on a biblical level he had never fulfilled the mitzvah, because this is the koyach that Chachamim have, that neglecting to do what they're saying can affect the mitzvah deraisa. Now, I don't think that with matzah that's the case. In other words, if a person neglects to recline while eating the matzah, whilst he has not fulfilled the obligation to eat matzah and he has to eat the matzah again, I don't think it's true to say that he hasn't fulfilled it on a biblical level. On a biblical level, he has fulfilled the mitzvah of matzah, but he has to eat it again because on a rabbinic level, he hasn't yet done so. Okay, now, when it comes to the 4 cups of wine, there's various levels of sort of the best possible way to do it is to have a full cup all the way to the brim with wine, not grape juice, and to drink the whole cup in one go. That's the best possible way to do it. And then, sort of working your way down, if that's too difficult, you sort of move down into well, you don't have to have the whole cup. You can have the revius, the lugma. I forget all the different things. But by the way, it's ideal to get yourself a small cup. It has to be a cup that's a revius, so it has to be, I think they say 4 ounces or something. Yeah, well, 3.5 ounces or whatever the exact measurement is. There's no need to have a big becher, and then you won't be able to drink the whole thing. Better to have a small cup that's just the right size. And
one year that I purchased a big becher, I didn't realize how big it was, and after 2 cups, I woke up at 4 a.m. and had to do the rest of the other 2 cups. That was 1 year. That was 4 a.m. I'm like, where is everybody? I got up and I think I had grape juice for the last 2 cups.
Yeah, so you don't. No, but the minimal requirement of the cup is to drink. I think it's Reiv Revius. I think is the minimal requirement. So
3.5 ounces.
No, but that's the minimum requirement of the cup. But the minimum requirement of how much of the cup you have to drink is the first 51% of it. Let's say, right?
Yeah.
Now, you have to fill the cups to the brim, ideally, for sure. Now, often what people do, if you don't mind me using this cup to illustrate, is the cup is to the brim, and you're making Kiddush or saying Hakadah sitting upright, like we said before, and now you have to get into that position, and right? So what people often tend to do is they like sort of sip it as they're going down there. Now that's problematic because the first part of the cup, which is the basic obligation to drink, has to be in the reclining position. So you have to, you put the cup down, get into position, and then take it. So again, it sounds technical, but that's the way we do the mitzvah of Haseba.
You can use a straw.
It's a good question. Using a straw for the 4 cups. I don't know.
The clock is wrong.
What?
I set it to the wrong time.
What time is it now?
It's 9:40.
9:40.
Okay, so it's 2 minutes, 3 minutes behind. No, there's no shortage of what to discuss. The question is what's going to fit into the time.
You can't use a straw because you got to spill it all over yourself.
Okay, so women don't have to do Haseba.
Is that what you thought?
That's my pilpul.
Is that what you thought?
Yeah, you got to read the whole thing.
Well, women don't have to recline.
There's people pilpul and
We're talking
YG.
about reclining.
I think I have a copy of it.
Only the
You know what? We'll leave. I'm going to leave the discussion of women to next week. I'm going to discuss something else. There is. So, why did they institute Haseba? Because Haseba is a way of expressing freedom and royalty and etc. etc. Now, nowadays, that's not a way to eat. I mean, even royalty don't eat that way, right? The Queen of England sits on a chair when she eats. She doesn't
properly.
recline. Yeah. So what are we doing? Why are we still doing this reclining business?
It's we're old-fashioned.
Tradition.
So the answer is, like many things in halacha, 2 days Yom Tov, for example, that once the Chachamim institute something, even if the reason for it no longer applies, the takana remains in place. That's the general. That's a general rule in all areas of halacha. Once there was a legal legislation of a certain obligation, precept, or whatever it is, that remains in place until perhaps when Mashiach comes, there'll be a bezdin who, in order to change it, you need to have a bezdin that is bigger, that is greater than the bezdin who instituted it. So until Mashiach comes, that's not a possibility. And b'meila, everything remains in place. So even though the Chachamim instituted a mitzvah of Haseba, a mitzvah to recline. So even though reclining is not necessarily in vogue nowadays, but it doesn't matter because that was the legislation, that was what they did, and b'meila, there's no way we still have to do it. Now there is, and this is very, very important. This is something that has ramifications in virtually every shaila of Haseba. It's called the Shitta of the Ra'avyo. The Ra'avyo, whose name I forget, but that's the acronym for his name. But he is the author of the Sefer Avi HaEzri, who he said no, that we don't have to do Haseba nowadays. Nowadays, that's not the way that free people and royalty eat. And mainly, there's no mitzvah to do it anymore.
I have a clarifying question. I remember studying for Purim that Purim is going to be the only holiday that we celebrate after Mashiach comes. So we'll be observing the seder after Mashiach comes. So why would the super duper base thing even discuss this? Because we won't be doing it anymore.
That's a good question. When it says that the Yom Tovim will fade into oblivion other than Purim, and I don't think it means that we won't be fulfilling those Yom Tov in a literal sense of the word. I think what it means is that that the significance of it won't be in contrast to what's going on over there in the times of Mashiach. The significance of Pesach, for example, won't be significant, but the halachas of the Torah won't change. The halachas that you have to keep, the mitzvahs of the Seder night won't change. In fact, this is even said explicitly in the Haggadah, that we say you have to remember the Exodus of Egypt by night or by day, and we say, well, it says you remember it the days of your life, and then it says all the days of your life. So the extra word "all" means
The
night as well. And then it says then the mitzvah the requirement to remember the exodus of Egypt will apply even when Mashiach comes. It means even and the idea is that even when Mashiach comes and we'll be celebrating the redemption of Mashiach and the redemption of Egypt will seem insignificant, nevertheless there'll still be an obligation to require it, to remember it. And I assume that the idea is because ultimately the exodus of Egypt is the sort of the root to all redemptions, and therefore the redemption to come, the future redemption, with all its grand, with all its tremendous meaning, is connected very much to the exodus of Egypt, and that's why the mitzvah.
You may have to change some of the wording.
Yeah, and
like we're still slaves of.
Yeah, no, of course. The word
generation, at that point that won't be
right. So exactly the format may be slightly different. That's the question is a good question, and perhaps I'll look into it a bit more this week and address it again next week or on one of the Monday nights.
Does that affect the davening? Because every day we say it's
of course.
So are we still going to say it's yes?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Let me just. I'm going to finish off with this Rav Yor. I was explaining this Rav Yor, and right. So the question is, what's pshat in this Rav Yor? Why does the Rav Yor? The Rav Yor says that we don't. That nowadays there's no mitzvah of haseba.
Who is Rav Yor?
The Rav Yor is one of the Rishonim. The Rav Yor Ezri is called Rav Yor, right? Why this? And this is going to be very, very relevant when we talk about women doing haseba. It's relevant all over the place. Why? We've just discussed the principle. We keep 2 days as Yom Tov, even though it's not relevant anymore, and we do many, many things that are not relevant anymore. So why should the mitzvah of haseba be an exception to the rule?
Yeah.
So the pshat is like this. I'll ask you another question before I tell you the pshat. The Rashbam, on his commentary to the Gemara in Pesachim, it talks about the mitzvah of haseba. So he describes what's haseba. He says it means that you should recline, as is the way of free people, with a bed at the table, zeicha lecherus.
Whoa.
And this is even so. What's the table got to do with anything? Okay, a bed, a couch, a chair, fine. But why is having the table part of the requirement of reclining? And in fact, in Shulchan Aruch it says that you're supposed to put your beautiful kelim on the table, all your silver and everything. So now we're all OCD, and silver might be chametz, so we don't put anything on the table. But in Shulchan Aruch it says that all your silverware should be placed on the table because that's the way. Even though usually that might be considered somewhat. Even in bad light, like you're sort of flaunting your wealth or whatever it is, but on the seder night that's appropriate, right? So the pshat is like this. The pshat is like this. The Rav Yor understands that the Rav Yor's understanding of this mitzvah is that actually there was never any legislation that you have to recline at the seder, and this goes similar to what we started out with. The legislation, the mitzvah is the legislation is that you have to act in a manner of freedom. Now, in a time that the way free people ate was in reclining, so then that's how the mitzvah expressed itself. Once the societal norms changed, so the mitzvah today is to eat in a manner, to act and eat and behave in a manner of free people today. Not free people 500 years ago. There was never such a legislation. And that also explains, by the way, the whole concept of having the things on the table. And why does the Rashbam mention a table? Well, because it's not just about go and eat in this position on the couch. Free people and royalty don't sit on the couch. They sit at a table. It's the experience of dining in a free way, dining in a royal way. So that's why the table and having your expensive silverware on the table is important. So, according to the Rav Yah, he's not saying that nowadays there's no mitzvah of Haseba. He's saying that nowadays you fulfill the mitzvah of Haseba by sitting upright. Now, this has tremendous nafka tremendous practical relevance, and that is that if a person is not doing the mitzvah of Haseba, let's talk about women. That's the simplest way to think. Well, again, we'll discuss women more next week, but women don't have to do Haseba, so women are not reclining. Now, what happens, for example, a woman has a newborn baby who's in the bassinet and crying, and it's grinding on her nerves. So she's going to go over there and she's going to eat her matzah, rocking the pram, right? So that's no good, because even though a woman is not obligated to recline, but she's still obligated to fulfill the mitzvah, to act as a free person on the seder night. Free people don't eat the way you eat, and is a freedom. The Queen of England doesn't walk around munching snacks. She sits down when she eats, right?
So they also don't serve the rest of the table all night long.
Right? No, but that's the mitzvah. The mitzvah is that while you're eating the kazayas matzah and the 4 cups of wine and to act as a free person. So even though a woman has no obligation to recline like men do, but she does have an obligation to be sitting comfortably while she eats and drinks the 4 cups of wine, and while she eats the matzah and the afikomen and the kerech. So here we see that the Rav Yah says, reclining doesn't apply nowadays. But when we analyze it a bit further, well, what is he actually saying? Well, he's not abolishing a mitzvah. He's saying that the mitzvah has a different definition, and we see from that, and that brings us to a very important, right? If a woman ate matzah standing up, the halacha would be that she has to eat the matzah again, that she did not fulfill her obligation, and she would have to eat the matzah again, sitting upright. Okay, we'll stop here, and Mitzvah Hashem next week we'll continue to discuss some other matters of Haseba. Please.
It was printed.